The gymnosperms are a group of plants that are seed plants that do not make flowers. We could also say that they produce seeds that are exposed rather than enclosed in fruits, which is another difference. And so they're sometimes called naked seeded plants. Most modern gymnosperms are woody shrubs or trees. And the gymnosperms were some of the plants that did well when the Earth's climate cooled. And so they still do well in relatively cold and dry habitats. So think like the mountains of Colorado, for example, is a place that gymnosperms do well because it's cold and relatively dry. There's 3 phylums in the category of gymnosperm. So we'll take a look at the cladogram. So here's our cladogram. So there's our pteridophytes back here. And then we have wood, ovules, seeds, and pollen as the critical innovations of the seed plants. Let me take a moment to say something that I haven't mentioned before. So notice that euphylls occur here and here as a critical innovation. So everybody after this point has euphylls, but we have it in these different positions. And what that tells us is that they arose through convergent evolution. So instead of having euphyll here, okay, we didn't put it there because if we had put it there, remember that means that there was an ancestor that had it and passed it on to these different organisms. But because we have it here and here, it says that there was 2 different evolutionary events. The pteridophytes got euphylls through one type of evolution or one evolutionary process, and the seed plants got euphylls through a second evolutionary process, both type, so convergent evolution, okay? So here's woods, ovules, seeds, and pollen. And so here are our gymnosperms. And there's 3 phyla now in there, the Cycads, the Gingko, and Conifers and Natalis. We'll talk briefly about Cycads and Ginkgos, but we'll mainly talk about Conifers because they're the largest group of gymnosperms. So Cycads are a small group of gymnosperms. They're primarily found in tropical and subtropical regions. Many of them are endangered because tropical and subtropical regions are endangered. There are some houseplants that fall into this category. They have stems that can look kind of like tree trunks or are underground. They have leaves that almost look like palm trees. So you can see that here in this picture. And many of them are actually toxic. Sometimes the houseplant version is not safe for pets for that reason, and that's to deter consumption by animals. Their reproduction involves ovules and seeds and pollen. They have cone-like structures, so they almost look like pine cones. They're not pine cones, but they look like them. And they have an unusual feature. The cones actually smell really bad, so that cone is kind of stinky, and that stinky smell attracts beetles. And the beetles will walk along the structure, and as they do, they end up with pollen on them, and then they move it from male to female ones. So the beetles end up carrying the pollen to ovules. So this is unusual for gymnosperms. Most gymnosperms are wind pollinated. So it's an unusual feature of cycads that they're beetle pollinated. Another unusual feature of the cycads is they have these roots that grow along the surface. They're called coralloid roots. So they're actually above ground. And the reason why they're above ground is they actually have cyanobacteria growing in them and getting light. So they need light. If you cut open the roots, you see this layer of green. That's the cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are also capable of fixing nitrogen. And so the cyanobacteria living in the roots help feed nitrogen to the cycad. This is a mutualism. That means it's a beneficial partnership between 2 organisms. The cyanobacteria are getting protection by living in the roots of these plants, and the cycad is getting nitrogen fed to it by the bacteria. Gingko is another group of gymnosperms. It's actually only 1 species today. So we have a whole phylum theoretically, but there's only 1 species in it. All the rest of the members of this phylum have gone extinct a long time ago. In fact, the one remaining species, Ginkgo biloba, almost went extinct in the wild. However, it is popular as an urban tree. So especially in the Midwest of our country, they're widely planted along city streets, though only the males, because the female tree produces this a seed here that has a fleshy coating on it that people don't like because it is stinky and stains stuff. So that's why only the male trees are planted. Ginkgo, many people have heard of Ginkgo biloba. It's a popular supplement for mental brain health, I guess you could say. So that's another reason why it's still around today. The name biloba references bilobe, and so they have these really pretty leaves. I think they're really pretty. They have two sides to them, or two lobes, and that's what biloba means. The conifers are the largest gymnosperm group, and that's why I said we'll talk about them the most. We find conifers, especially in mountains, like I mentioned in Colorado, or high latitude, so like northern, like Canada, places like that, forests. Most of them are evergreen. That means they don't lose their leaves in the fall. And evergreen is the opposite of the term deciduous. Deciduous trees do lose their leaves in the fall. They form reproductive structures called cones. They have either pollen cones, which are the male pollen-producing cones, or they have ovulate cones, or ovule-bearing cones, or the female cones. Most people are more familiar with the female cone, so when you think pine cone, you're thinking probably of the female cone. The pollen cones are much smaller, so sometimes like as much as like a pinky or something like that, like a pinky's length. And they're super soft, so they fall apart. Like if you touch them with your fingers, they'll actually crumble because they're temporary. So they only make pollen for a short part of the year. That's when they're fresh. And then after that, they kind of dry up and crumble. When they're making pollen, the pollen is getting released to the wind. So wind just blows and gets the pollen off of those pollen cones. And then the pollen lands on the female cones. And when the pollen lands on the female cones, the sperm are delivered to the ovules. So you probably know some conifers. So for example, in our region, we have like the ponderosa pine is a really common one when you first kind of head up to the forest. Blue spruce is the tree of Colorado. That's a conifer. Limber pine is another one you may have heard of. It's almost the winter holidays right now, so Christmas trees are, of course, examples of conifers. So that you may have heard of like a Douglas fir or noble fir. Those are some of the ones that are commonly sold for Christmas trees. So those are examples of some conifers. Here's some pictures. This is a ponderosa pine. As I mentioned, this is one that's native to Colorado. A dawn redwood or sequoia, which is a Pacific Coast tree. And here's some lovely ovulate cones. So again, these are the female cones, these big prominent ones. So what happens is a pine cone like that has seeds inside of it. And so usually when you're looking at a pine cone, like if it's fallen onto the ground, it's probably old. And so it doesn't have any seeds still on it. So it has all that woody stuff. Tucked inside of it is the seeds, and those usually end up breaking out of it. In some cases, like this picture here, there's actually like almost like a soft stuff on it that helps them travel by wind. So the seeds can also get blown and travel by wind because they have these little wings on them. Other conifers actually have some kind of fleshy coat on them. So this is a yew seed with like red fleshy coating. This is a juniper cone, which also has a fleshy coating. These are desirable to animals in some cases. So this bright colors can attract birds, for example, to eat it. Junipers have a distinct flavor that many animals like, including humans. Juniper is a flavoring in a lot of stuff. So let me just be clear, though, that like when we look at these and we see the word fleshy coating, we might think fruit, but this is not true fruit. So a fleshy coating is not the same thing as fruit. And again, that can get a little confusing because sometimes we even use the word berry, like juniper cones are oftentimes referred to as juniper berries. But again, remember that's not a fruit because these are gymnosperms. Conifers have other adaptations that suit them, help them adapt well to cold climates. And so another reason why they're found in places like the mountains and northern forests. So when you think about a conifer, you may see this sort of iconic shape in your brain. This is the conical shape, and that shape helps shed snow. So snow will slide off of the tree rather than breaking its branches. Even if snow collects on the branches, conifers will just be able to bend and flop their branch down. Like, for example, if you've seen conifer trees, oftentimes they will transport them. So if this is the tree's branches, right, and there's the trunk, they're so flexible, you can actually just fold those branches up and tie this up with rope or netting, and it doesn't hurt the tree at all, right? So I like to have live Christmas trees at my house for when I celebrate Christmas. And so you can just take those branches and just bend them, and they don't break. They're much more resistant to breaking, I should say. They can break under, if you really, really try, but they're much more resistant to breaking. And again, that's an adaptation for heavy snow load. Snow can land on them, but they'll bend and recover after the snow melts. When we look at the leaves of conifers, we call them needles oftentimes, or in the case of junipers, we might call them scales. They have this distinct kind of skinny shape, and they're also heavily coated in wax. So if you feel a pine needle, it's very waxy and rigid, and that's to hold in moisture in dry climates. So it's really well adapted for holding in moisture. A big, broad, flat leaf, like a traditional deciduous tree, loses tons of moisture off of this exposed surface area. Most conifers are evergreen, and the reason why many of them are evergreen has to do with this needle shape and also living in colder environments. So they just don't get as much photosynthesis even during the summer. So because of their cold climates and because of the needle shape, they just can't boost photosynthesis as much as a deciduous tree can with that big, broad leaf shape and warm summers. And so instead of being able to only do photosynthesis in the summer and go dormant, they always keep up some level of photosynthesis. They don't get as much in the summer, but they're doing a little bit in the winter too, and so that kind of evens out. So that helps them survive where they do well. So the life cycle of a gymnosperm is going to feature these parts that we've already talked about: sieves, ovules, and pollen. It has a dominant sporophyte generation. So the gametophyte is so reduced, it's only in the pollen grains and it's only inside of these reproductive structures. It's never independent at all. The seeds will develop from fertilized ovules. The pollen transfers the sperm to ovules. The seed that matures is a naked seed, so it's not going to be coated in fruit. And so we'll see that life cycle here. Whoops, wrong direction. So here's our pine life cycle. Again, these life cycles can be so overwhelming, so I want to remind you that we have spores that are haploid. Whoops. Haploid spores go through mitosis and produce gametophytes. Gametophytes will mature gametes. Gametes will have fertilization, so egg and sperm will fertilize. That fertilization will lead to a zygote that goes through mitosis and forms a sporophyte. And then the sporophyte will go through meiosis, so this is the only time meiosis occurs, to produce spores. Okay, so remember that gametes are formed by maturation in a plant life cycle, not meiosis. The sporophyte will produce spores through meiosis. So that's our basic plant life cycle that we keep seeing over and over again, just with like slight variations in it. So let's take a look here at the mature sporophyte. So we'll start here with the sporophyte. This is the tree that we're all familiar with, right? And so within the sporophyte, there will be certain places where it will commit to reproduction. So it will make cones, right? That's how it commits to reproduction. So within the tree, it will make either an ovule cone or a pollen cone. So in the pollen cone, it's going to carry out meiosis. So within that structure, there are microsporangia that are going to make these microspores through meiosis. So here we have the microsporangia with microspores inside of it that were made by meiosis. Okay, and then what will happen is that those microspores, they're haploid, will go through mitosis to make a pollen grain. And then within that pollen grain, some of the cells will mature into sperm. So a pollen grain is the male gametophyte made from microspores. And within that male gametophyte, some of the cells matured into sperm. Okay, so we'll leave our pollen grain here for a second and go back to the ovule cone. In the ovule cone, deep inside of the ovule cone, we will have meiosis inside of a megasporangium that produces a megaspore. And so the megaspore is haploid within this megasporangium, again, because of meiosis. So the megaspore will go through mitosis and produce this female gametophyte tissue. And within the female gametophyte, some cells will become eggs. So we have the female gametophyte inside of the megasporangium, and this is wrapped in integument, this protective tissue. Okay, so that is the ovule then, is this whole structure here, okay, where the egg is. So then what's going to happen is pollination. Okay, so remember, first pollination, then fertilization. So a pollen grain is usually travels by wind for most conifers or gymnosperms. So the pollen grain gets blown over to the ovule cone, and the pollen grain lands on this area where the ovule is. The pollen grain sends down a pollen tube, and then the sperms are able to travel down that pollen tube to the egg. So here's our pollen tube, the sperm being delivered to the egg. So now fertilization can happen. Now we have a zygote. So the fertilized egg is the zygote. The zygote is diploid. It will go through mitosis and form the embryo. So here's our baby embryo plant. This is multicellular. This is going to be a new sporophyte. But for now, it's encased in this tissue inside of the integument. And what will happen is this will harden into a seed coat. And so here's the seeds that will be released when they're done, right? So they have to mature, the seed coat has to harden, and then this seed will go out into the environment and wait. And so it will go dormant until a time in which it's ready to start growing again through mitosis and become a seedling, and maybe someday become a mature sporophyte or the tree, a new tree. So that's the pine life cycle.